Endurance. The Life and Death of Jiu-Jitsu, First Book Collection. Autographic Publisher. By Alexander Paiva Cardoso. ISBN N2-978-85-518297773. First edition in July 2019. Autography edition and limited communication. Rua Marinque Veiga, N2 10th floor, downtown, Rio de Janeiro, RJ. Version compiled for audiobook by the author. All rights reserved. Reproduction of this work for commercial purposes is prohibited. Cover and back cover. Loyalty and fidelity are necessary qualities in a martial artist. When we have the opportunity to witness publications, with truthfulness, respect for people and history, it is essential that we have time to taste between the lines all the moments lived and the feelings involved. The author is different, and always stands out wherever he is. It was at the Police Department of Rio de Janeiro, Police Academy, that I could observe his qualities as a professional, instructor and fighter. As a scholar that he is, he did not allow himself to stagnate. It is constantly evolving and seeking knowledge, always rebuilding itself with each class it teaches. Making an analogy, I remember a visit we made to the Grand Master Elio Gracie in Itaipava City, accompanying the Grand Masters, João Alberto Barreto, Flavio Bering, Alvaro Barreto, Francisco Mansur and friends. My father leafed through the scrapbooks where he was featured in the articles, and surprised he said, "What an honor to be on the pages of this album, after all, this is your master story." The Grand Master gave his traditional laugh and said, "But in my story, you are the chapters." As soon as I see this connection between loyal students and their masters. The Fadda family has a great legacy, and its relevance through this work is a remarkable presence. Thanks to the competence and charisma of our dear friend Professor Alexander Paiva, a loyal representative of the Fadda lineage, who preserves and enhances the value of his masters, seeking through his testimony to rescue the essence of his formation as a man by this school of so much tradition. Respectfully, Master Silvio Damada Bering, 8th grade Coral Belt Jiu-Jitsu. Fundamentals of Fairy Jiu-Jitsu. Technical Training and Guidance Program for Fadda Jiu-Jitsu Teachers, Instructors and Multipliers. Module 1, Compendium. This unpretentious work, for the most part, is based on reports from people who lived through historic moments in the construction of Jiu-Jitsu Fadda, as well as academic research, registered publications and other documents as subsidies. It does not mean that all content is seen as the purest truth, but rather as another pedagogical instrument based on the historical and philosophical heritage of the contents taught in Fadda schools by the great masters of the past. Within the knowledge and reality experienced at the time, we sought to reflect the feeling that many practitioners of the early days of Jiu-Jitsu felt when highlighting or teaching the history of Jiu-Jitsu and philosophy of life at Fadda Academy. The entire context described can be revised, changed or receive greater contributions, because, as we have reported, pragmatism and radical views are not our intention. Let it be clear that this work is not for profit and was carried out to ensure the memory of the name Fadda, an important historical follow-up in the construction of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It is up to the listener, or reader of the book, to understand and analyze it in a comprehensive way, allowing himself the stimulating search for knowledge and the practice of continued studies of such a great subject, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Topics covered will be Introduction, Presentation, General Objective, Justification, Specific Objective, the arrival of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, the introduction of Jiu-Jitsu in the Brazilian Navy, the birth of Fadda Jiu-Jitsu, Master Mitsuyo Maeda Conde Coma, Professor Luiz de Franca Filho, Grand Master Oswaldo Baptista Fadda, Grand Master Alexander de Souza Neves Chandu, Grand Master Humberto Fadda, the Fadda Jiu-Jitsu Academies, the construction of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the relationship between Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and Jiu-Jitsu. Fadda, Master Fadda's philosophical and technical concepts, the pioneers of sport Jiu-Jitsu, the characteristics of a Fadda coach, next books. Bibliographic sources and final considerations. For thanks and memorial. Very grateful to all the encouragement I received from my friends, teachers, masters and also from my family. For those who don't know Jiu-Jitsu, don't make a living from Jiu-Jitsu and don't even have a family that works with Jiu-Jitsu, it's very difficult to understand the moments when our body can't stand pain and locomotor difficulties. Difficulties in having to use one's own body as a work tool, even when it is not in conditions of use. Our sacred tool depends on care, which unfortunately Jiu-Jitsu cannot offer us, because the movements and techniques exist to cause controlled and neutralizing injuries to the opponents, but in the development of demonstrations, or even in simple training, fatally the techniques can result in involuntary injuries in light of the effectiveness of jiu-jitsu. Sometimes we are called attention to stop a little, regain strength in order to guarantee better results. But unfortunately, even with all the guidelines, many of us practitioners and coachers go over all reason, more logical and understandable criteria stated, with the risk of compromising our health. This so that our classes are not interrupted. We say that our classes or training will be just light training. What? Light training? None of that, because when we realize it, we are already involved in order to forget any kind of inconvenience. It is difficult for a family to understand that the option of teaching jiu-jitsu and love for it is something greater than financial values. In the same way, it is also difficult to understand that the manager and coach compromise their own physical health in their development, and, many times, even the financial conditions in favor of other people's lives and their dreams. Many of them, who neither know him nor deserve such vigorous attention, sometimes greater attention than that of the family itself. We know that jiu-jitsu is one of the most fabulous vehicles for social inclusion, breaking paradigms, valuing human beings, providing palliative care and even curing many physical and emotional ills. For these reasons, we encourage teachers and practitioners, together with their families, to seek a point of balance and equity, so that everything goes fairly and perfectly, for the sake of order and everything that jiu-jitsu really advocates as an educational system, familial, moral and social. Much more than a set of fighting techniques, jiu-jitsu is a philosophical and cultural system and a set of teachings that will follow with its fans for the rest of their lives. Therefore, we dedicate this work to all Faddas, friends, masters and Grand Masters of Jiu-Jitsu, as well as to the families of Grand Masters Luis de Franca, Oswaldo Baptista Fadda, Umberto Fadda and Alexander Chandu. Those who have their names registered, directly or indirectly, left their marks in the dissemination of martial arts linked to jiu-jitsu and were mainly part of the author's life.
Mestre Adair Alves. Mestre Aguinaldo Góes. Mestre Antônio Vieira. Mestre Aderbal Batista. Mestre Aldemir Tavares Rosa. Professor Alan Escorpião da CDD. Professor Alexandre Baraúna. Professor Alexandre Pleitiu da CDD. Professor Alessandro Galamba. Professor Aldo Fal. Professor Álvaro Bobadilla. Mestre Aristeu Mesquita. Professor Arthur Gogó. Mestre Alexandre PH. Mestre Alfredo Dornelles. Mestre Almir Trajano. Mestre Álvaro Barreto. Mestre Álvaro Mansor. Mestre Álvaro Splinter. Mestre Amauri Guarilha. Mestre Amauri do Espírito Santo. Mestre Anderson Pereira Evangelista. Professor André Araújo. Mestre André Viana. Mestre Antônio da Silva Ângelo. Mestre Antônio Ferreira da PECIR. Professor Antônio Júnior. Mestre Arlans Maia. Mestre Arnaldo Pestana. Mestre Haroldo da Silva Porto. Professor Haroldo Cabelinho. Professor Aurélio Fernandes. Bia da CBJJ. Mestre Brás. Professor Broa da CDD. Professor Bruno Bastos. Professor Bruno Soares da CDD. Mestre Carlos Alberto Dias. Professor Carlão Barreto. Professor Carlos Alberto Beto. Mestre Carlos Antônio. Mestre Carlos Breda. Mestre Carlos Robson Grace. Mestre Célio Caneca. Mestre Célio Cruz. Mestre Celso Pereira da Silva. Mestre Celso Salmeira. Mestre Sirval Justino. Professor Chandler Paiva. Mestre Cláudio Luna. Professor Cláudio Afonso. Mestre Cláudio Marculino. Professor Cleiton Mangueira. Professor Kleber Júnior. Professor Kleiber Maia. Professor Carlos Pedro Kiko. Mestre Demétrio Garcia. Professor Denilson Pimenta. Mestre Deuclésio Paulo. Professor Dave Moraes. Mestre Djalma Cavalcante. Professor Draque da Quioto. Mestre Edmilson Alves. Mestre Edson Leandro. Mestre Eduardo da Rocha. Mestre Eduardo Raimundo de Souza. Mestra Eliane Flores. Professor Eugêque da Infight. Mestre Eugênio Tadeu. Mestre Evilásio Veloso. Mestre Evaristo. Professor Ezequiel Coutinho. Professor Fabrício Moraes da CDD. Professor Fábio Kiui Otacal. Professor Felipe Bocão. Mestre Fernandes Simplício. Mestre Fernando. Mestre Fernando Soares. Professor Flávio Molina. Mestre Francisco Dantas Silvão. Mestre Gabriel Gabu. Mestre Genilson da Costa. Mestre Geraldo Flores. Mestre Guilherme Fadda. Professor Gustavo Bigu. Mestre Gustavo Raimundo de Souza. Professor Hélio Fadda Xuxo. Mestre Hércules Batista. Professor Herman Santos. Mestre Hermes Ciardulli. Mestre Hermes Pinto. Mestre Idelbrando Coca-Cola. Mestre Hilton Leão. Professor Iago Jardim. Mestre Hulk Terra Firme. Professor Inácio. Professor Ismael Souza. Professor Isaac Araújo. Mestre Ivan Batista. Dona Isélia Fadda. Mestre Jacê Paulino. Mestre Jair Hilário. Mestre Jair Reis. Professor Jair Corte. Mestre João Alberto Barreto. Mestre João Fernandes. Professor Joacir. Professor João Daniel da FFKI. Mestre João Constância. Mestre João Rezende Souza Filho. Mestre Jonas Silva de Oliveira. Mestre Jorge Guedes. Professor Jorge Luiz Braga de Moraes. Mestre Jorge Luiz da Cruz. Mestre Jorge Pina Barbosa. Mestre José Lopes Coutinho. Mestre José Higino. Mestre Joilson. Professor Jorginho Maromba. Mestre José Neuri Gomes Júnior. Professor Juarez Soares. Mestre Júlio César Pereira da GF Tim. Mestre Jurandir Jimenez Lando. Mestre Juventino de Paula, Aranha. Carla Bela FJJ Rio. Professora Cátia Amêndola. Professora Kira Grace. Mestre Cado. Kênia Grace FJJ Rio. Mestre Laerte Barcelos. Mestre Laurindo Leão. Mestre Leopoldo de Luca. Professor Leonardo Spekterov. Professor Léo Tintones. Lili da FJJD Rio. Mestre Lourival da Silva Torpedo. Professor Luciano Mendes. Mestre Luiz Carlos Guedes de Castro. Mestre Luiz Lula. Mestre Manuel Xavier Gonçalves Filho. Mestre Manuel Caiado. Mestre Manuel Rodrigues dos Santos. Mestre Marcelo Sobrinho da Silva. Professor Marcone Mendanha. Professora Márcia Jaqueline Storani. Márcia Rodrigues da Silveira Paiva. Professor Márcio Ramalho. Professor Márcio Clemen. Professor Mário Eugênio Marinho. Professor Mauro André. Mestre Marcos dos Santos Costa. Professor Marcos Fadda. Professor Marco Pitt de Betânia. Mestre Massam Elguino. Maicon Jefferson Muniz. Mestre Meireles. Professor Marcos Belo. Mestre Marcial Serrano. Mestre Miro Maravilha. Misa do Professor Herman Santos. Mestre Moisés Murad. Mestre Moacir Luzia Vale. Mestre Monir Salomão. Mestre Monsueto Gomes. Mestre Nélio Naja. Mestre Neném. Mestre Nilo Gutierrez. Mestre Nilton Pereira da Silva. Mestre Nimar Batista Sargento. Professor Ninias Vieira. Mestre Olandi Pinto Fachada. Mestre Orivaldo, Ori. Mestre Osmar Laurindo Mazinho. Professor Oscar de Betânia. Mestre Osório Dias de Oliveira. Osvaldo Fadda Filho, Vavá. Mestre Orlando Barradas. Mestre Ovídio Dias de Oliveira. Professor Pablo Ventura. Mestre Paulo César Gomes. Comandante Paulo César Amêndola. Professor Paulo André da PC. Mestre Pedro Costa. Mestre Pedro Gama Filho. Mestre Plínio Dutra. Mestre Raul Arnoux Spengler. Professor Raoni Barcelos. Professor Rafael Oliveira da CDD. Professor Renan Fadda. Professor Reginaldo Xavier. Mestre Ricardo Egídio. Professor Renato Rio das Pedras. Mestre Roberto Cavalcante. Mestre Roberto Leitão. Mestre Robson Bandeira. Mestre Rodolfo Valentino. Professor Rodolfo Vieira. Professor Rodrigo Dubala. Professor Rogério Gavaza. Professor Rogério da Tatacai. Professor Rogério Poglio. Mestre Rouquer Grace. Professor Romeu de Freitas Valente. Senhora Rosa Maria Fadda. Professor Rui da Tatacai. Mestre Salustiano. Mestre Santa Rosa. Mestre Sebastião Ricardo. Professor Sérgio Cachorrão. Mestre Sérgio Ferreira Bastos. Professor Sérgio Magalhães Magazinho. Mestre Sérgio Vieira de Barros. Professor Serginho Super-Homem. Mestre Silvio Pereira da Ferge. Tia Marlene da Ferge. Mestre Takeshi Ueda da Heisei-kan. Comandante Tatiana Mendes. Mestre Ubirajara Magalhães. Mestre Ushimasa Nagashimi. Mestre Valdemar Abrão. Mestre Valdomiro. Mestre Vasco. Mestre Vander da equipe Gilvan Santos. Mestre Ventapane. Professor Vitor Belfort. Professor Vicente de Paula da GM Rio. Professor Vinícius Amaral. Dona Vilma da FJJ Rio. Dona Vera, Paula e Monique da Seitim. Professor Wagner Gomes. Professor Vale de Ismail. Mestre Valdec. Mestre Valdomiro Caetano Valente. Mestre Walter Guimarães. Mestre Walter Nogueira. Mestre Walter Filho. Mestre Wendel Alexander. Professor William Caetano. Professor William Ninja. Mestre Willis Lucas Filho da Maeda. Mestre Wilson Pereira Matos. Mestre Itaboraí de Alvarenga Pereira. Professor Zanon de Betânia.
There are many Fadda descendants in Brazil and around the world, above all the masters and friends who defend and fly the flag of Jiu-Jitsu. Different academies, notably those of Bento Ribeiro, commanded by Oswaldo Fadda and Chandu, and Cascadura, commanded by Umberto Fadda and Elio Fadda, gave rise to the teachings that we would like to highlight in this work. Fadda Bento Ribeiro/RJ, the Temple of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Fadda is headquartered, serving as a school, study base and meetings for all practitioners of the lineage. Under the aegis of Grand Master Elio Fadda and technical support from the author of this work, Professor Alexander Paiva, the Academy cultivates the most elementary roots of Jiu-Jitsu Fadda, in a classic way and within the standards of the vision of its founder Oswaldo Fadda, a full Jiu-Jitsu. There is currently only one Fadda descendant, in the degree of Grand Master, a blood member who today directs the Fadda Academy of Bento Ribeiro. He is one of the few masters who have graduated and are recognized in all official Jiu-Jitsu federations and confederations as a 9th degree red belt, Grand Master of Jiu-Jitsu, and he also disseminates some technical knowledge only to members closest to the practice of Jiu-Jitsu Fadda, techniques that are full of simplicity and masterful effectiveness. Based on calculations, perhaps Elio Fadda is the last genetic heir, and direct student of Master Oswaldo Fadda, to reach the rank of Grand Master, red belt in Jiu-Jitsu in the history of the Fadda family, that is, this work to be written, in the years 2018 and 2019 and in 2023 the audiobook was released on YouTube. They could be the last reliable reports and records of a family character who really lived the life story of Oswaldo Fadda in Jiu-Jitsu. Introduction. Following as an example, the basic concepts of education applied by the Grand Master of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, Professor Jigoro Kano, when he decided to create, from Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, Soft Path, the Fadda lineage Jiu-Jitsu schools, as an example of continuing and classical training, highlight the philosophical, technical and academic values of his teachings. Through teachers and masters, as multipliers of the fundamental precepts for the development and continuity in its classic essence spread by Fadda in the 1940s. Based on Grand Mestre Fadda's initiative in establishing a specific training program and forming graduates based on the intellectual credibility of the knowledge that involves all disciplines of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we can demonstrate a distinctly legitimate vision expected from the faculty of this art, represented by its teachers, masters and Grand Masters who make up the pillars of this noble Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu clan. This set of works, through a simple, complete dynamic, develops a way to multiply the knowledge acquired at Academia de Jiu-Jitsu Fadda, offering support to the teaching staff of monitors, instructors and teachers, with a focus on making them fit, recognized and pedagogically prepared for teaching, in line with the guidelines of Masters Oswaldo, Umberto, Chandu and Guilherme Fadda. Establishing a holistic view and highlighting, above all, the legality and legitimacy of the Fairy Jiu-Jitsu concept, this work begins by adding values to all those involved and lovers of the sport. Having verified difficulties in offering opportunities for the practice of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, mainly, to the humblest classes, the rules and heterogeneous organizational system, in which the structure of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has been constantly altered, and in view of the transformations that each entity and its segments carry out. Jiu-Jitsu schools are increasingly responsible for the education and philosophical dissemination of the sport to teachers, including reinforcing moral values that are so important for harmonious coexistence in sports groups. In this sense, it is often observed that the most vulnerable public in society, children and adolescents, without activities, idle, with the absence of an adult responsible for guiding them on a daily basis, end up being at the mercy of negative influences, putting into risk their physical and moral integrity in their daily lives. Finally, allowing isolation or even begging, the insertion in minor crimes, addictions due to the use of narcotics, inappropriate behavior, among others. Due to the great structural deficiency that today involves the human being in its entirety, and the difficulty of the public power to safeguard the less fortunate, many children and adolescents do not see another horizon that can motivate them. The difficulty in finding teachers who are prepared to accept and manage situations that go beyond sports techniques and practices are also factors that make it difficult to program this important sports segment. Presentation. Bento Ribeiro's Fadda Academy built an army of supporters and militants of suburban jiu-jitsu. A jiu-jitsu that had as its main flag the equal opportunity to practice this art. Through a rigid educational system, Fadda used jiu-jitsu as a tool to change the world by forming good citizens. Under the aegis of Grand Master Elio Batista Fadda, red belt, 9th degree, bachelor's degree and full degree in physical education from UGF, this work chronicle is directed, guided and managed by Professor Alexander Paiva Cardoso, black belt 6th degree, education professional physics, graduated in rescue and help from UNISA, postgraduated in higher education teaching from UCB. Instructor of renowned national and international institutions as coordinator of courses at FJJ Rio, FJJD Rio, FJJO and FJJP. It should be noted that, without any pretension of showing radicalism, doctrine, eruditeness and pragmatism, this work is based on personal studies of those involved, academic consultations, individual and perceptive experiences, which may not reflect with the opinion and agreement of all. For this reason, we ask you to understand the possibility that something reported in this work may not confirm with the personal and intellectual reality of the listener or reader. Mainly due to the fact that many of the teachers and masters at the time studied jiu-jitsu in a simple way, they did not have sources of literary consultations at their disposal, much less internet technology. Everything was passed on orally and directly to the students. Therefore, a lot comes according to the understanding of each one of them. Our data are from living witnesses in the construction of this fabulous academy. We hope that this work can contribute to the personal success of each reader or listener in the fantastic path that is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. General objective. Offer study material and promote technical and theoretical knowledge of the most classic fairy Jiu-Jitsu, culminating in the practical development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu teaching. Guarantee to the target public, academic community, and other lovers of martial arts, results that stimulate sports education, thus providing a path of opportunities, motivation to the development of research and studies of jiu-jitsu, noting that the students of this public will reflect all this investment. The arrival of jiu-jitsu in Brazil. Japanese jiu-jitsu is based on Brazilian jiu-jitsu, as well as judo created in 1882 by Jigoro Kano. It is believed that one of the possibilities for the official arrival of jiu-jitsu in Brazil was due to Jigoro Kano, physical education teacher and noble representative of Emperor Matsuhito, Emperor Meiji. Kano was very intelligent and, due to his ease with foreign languages, he stood out for being the creator of this new sport. He had left Japan, along with other teachers, to spread the Japanese sports martial art to the world, judo, soft way, at the time of Kano's jiu-jitsu. One of the teachers who came through Jigoro Kano's orders was Mitsuyo Maeda, or here in Brazil, Count Koma, until today the best known of the Japanese and one of the main responsible for jiu-jitsu being revealed to us. Through the opportunity presented by the Japanese who came to Brazil to present judo, we can really say that Brazilian jiu-jitsu had its foundations based on Japanese jiu-jitsu. That way, we had the first contacts with the martial art that would originate our current jiu-jitsu. It is impossible to say that jiu-jitsu, in its total context, was born in Brazil or created by us Brazilians. With absolute certainty, we can say that it came from Japan, as it was not the Indians who lived in Brazil or the European colonizers who invented it. It is Oriental by nature and, of course, it received a drastic change in its original development compared to the judo as we know it. The difference between Eastern and Brazilian jiu-jitsu is that, in Brazil, adapted techniques were developed, based on the origins of Japanese jiu-jitsu and even contents that the Japanese no longer highlighted in their original jiu-jitsu. These techniques developed here considered the characteristics discarded by judo and greatly valued the self-defense system in a practical, rational, and efficient way. In the vast majority, neutralizing the opponent through strangulation was valued, which caused the momentary unconsciousness of the opponent, or joint torsions that caused severe pain and impotence to continue the combat. All this development after leading the opponent to the ground. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was based on the fundamentals of Japanese practitioners with relevant technical participation from the Gracie family, considering the origins that identified this art as an effective self-defense system and also providing an adaptation to a simpler language and aimed at Brazilians. In the words of Grand Master Helio Gracie, "The Jiu-Jitsu I created was to give opportunities to the weakest." It reveals the same characteristics of the original Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, as the physical characteristics and the Oriental stereotype are fundamentally characterized by people of short stature and apparently weaker, mostly. This fact will be highlighted below through the comments on Professor Irving Hancock's book. According to researcher and coach Marco Antonio Ferreira, from the Minerva team at the University of Rio de Janeiro, UFRJ, he reports that, out of curiosity to find out a little more about the history of Jiu-Jitsu, he decided to research using scientific articles and came across the National Library with a vast collection of press. At the time, several notes where Jiu-Jitsu was highlighted were published almost daily. The first reference he found, and the oldest, dates back to the year 1905 when Professor Edward William Barton, who developed a fighting methodology and placed it as the most efficient to be beaten, challenged all known martial arts, and in this challenge he quotes Jiu-Jitsu as a martial art to be challenged. So, from there, we can believe that Jiu-Jitsu was already known to the Brazilian people. At the same time, Japan had just defeated Russia in the 1904 to 1905 war over some territories linked to China and Manchuria. After winning, stereotypes were highlighted about the Japanese with a small physical structure and apparently weak, but with a performance in physical combat never seen before. The world begins to study the Japanese way of life and generates curiosity among the people. A great find is the book by Mr. Irving Hancock, who goes to Japan to study the Japanese way of life and writes a book called Japanese Physical Education. This book was well explored here in Brazil by the Navy military. Jiu-Jitsu has a direct connection with the Brazilian Navy. It is largely responsible for bringing this art to the country, reporting that Jiu-Jitsu did not end up in Brazil here by chance. At that time, there was a whole trend towards Swedish gymnastics and some other methods of gymnastics as a way to clean people up in order to create a stronger, happier, and healthier people. Based on that book, including one of the introductory notes, it says that the Japanese people are the happiest, and healthiest people on the face of the earth. It was through judo that we had the full dissemination of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, since the intention of the Japanese Empire, through Jigoro Kano, was to promote Kano's Jiu-Jitsu, or the pedagogical and systematic way that would come to be known as Judo. Many supporters of the eclecticity and fullness of original Jiu-Jitsu techniques, which acted as Judo multipliers along with Jigoro Kano, were dissatisfied with the selection of content taken from Jiu-Jitsu for Judo by Kano. They did not accept that many high-value techniques were not considered to compose the newborn Judo and continued to teach the original Japanese knowledge. Maeda was one of the teachers who opened the doors of knowledge of the original Jiu-Jitsu. However, we will see in this work that many other characters make up the entire foundation that originated the Jiu-Jitsu we knew. The introduction of Jiu-Jitsu in the Brazilian Navy. In 1908, the school ship Benjamin Constant of the Brazilian Navy, making its trip around the world, on the route between Hawaii and Japan, finds Japanese shipwrecked on an island. The ship rescues the survivors and takes them back to Japan. There, due to the rescue of the Japanese shipwrecked, Brazilian sailors are awarded a great motion from the Japanese Empire. On the way, with the aim of strengthening relationships and covering a more balanced form of communication, some Brazilians on the ship gave a presentation of capoeira, Brazilian fight, and the Japanese of their unknown system of fights, Jiu-Jitsu. Reports from general officers who were in Japan and observed Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. Admiral Alexandrino, who was the Minister of War at the time, found that Jiu-Jitsu could really be an auxiliary tool in controlling revolts, precisely to maintain discipline and hierarchy in the Navy. At that time, sailors were not very obedient and discipline was based on whipping and punishment. The Navy, like all armed forces, has its pillars based on hierarchy and discipline, and officers had many difficulties in relating these precepts to their subordinates. Admiral Alexandrino, when faced with the conduct of Japanese sailors who practiced Jiu-Jitsu, verified a strong moral and disciplinary base. Alexandrino found an excellent tool to introduce to the Brazilian military. He envisioned that the disciplinary precepts of the martial art could collaborate with the formation of more educated, disciplined sailors who respected the hierarchy, as well as the Japanese military. Upon returning to Brazil, 3 of the rescued ship's crew decided to follow along, among them Jiu-Jitsu teacher Sada Miyako and sailor Kakarara. At that time, there were only 2 fighting sports that stood out, noble art or box and capoeira. As the name says, boxing, it was not a fight that was common access among the humblest and simplest people, and its practice was complicated due to the traumatic blows of punches, mainly in the head and face, for which they necessarily needed gloves, these high cost. Capoeira, on the other hand, had its most popular roots and was widely practiced by sailors. Due to the fact that capoeira did not have the systems of graduations and hierarchy that we have today, and was practiced without the slightest structure that sought the intellectuality, it was discriminated against and caused discomfort to military commanders in organizing their troops. In the second semester of 1908, the sailors Kakarara arrived in Brazil, who became a cabin boy on the island of Villaganhan, and the teacher Sada Miyako, who headed the mission to teach jiu-jitsu. Japanese sailor and jiu-jitsu teacher Sada Miyako was hired to teach the fundamental principle of Japanese martial arts to sailors. He forms his first classes of sailors and also ends up giving private lessons. Among these invited students, the first Brazilian jiu-jitsu teacher, Mario Aleixo in 1915, stands out. We remember that the implementation of jiu-jitsu in the Navy was intended to indoctrinate the sailors, and with the hiring of Miyako, Alexandrino's whole plan to educate and discipline his sailors was going very well. That was until one of the best-known capoeira practitioners, called Siriaco, challenged Sada Miyako to a dispute to see which fight was better. The result was disastrous for Alexandrino's attempts, as Sada Miyako, in front of all his students and the media at the time, took an immediate knockout. For the joy of all sailors, raising the morale of capoeira practitioners, and causing great indignation among officers. Note, we believe that due to the formal nature of Eastern combats, and Sada Miyako, before the fight, to recline her head for the usual initial greeting, was hit by a blow called stingray tail, before even having a chance to demonstrate her qualities. Siriaco certainly wasn't disloyal, but because he didn't know the rituals of Eastern culture, he went ahead with the fight and struck. With Miyako's defeat, as much as jiu-jitsu was an excellent vehicle for disciplinary promotion, it had lost its initial strength, but it still continued in the Navy. Shortly after, it lost its philosophical, liturgical, and disciplinary nature and became simply another military resource for hand-to-hand combat of the Marines. Miyako in 1908 and Takeo Yano in 1932 officially taught classes in the Marine Corps, the elite of the Brazilian Navy. It is speculated that Maeda and Satake also informally visited the Navy. Registers Gio Amori in 1932 in the military club and Nagashima in 1960. It is observed that from 1908 to 1914 there is a large interval, since in some studies the beginning of jiu-jitsu in Brazil is considered only with the arrival of Maeda in 1914. In 1905, as we highlighted, we had the first information about the name jiu-jitsu by William Barton, and from the experiences between the Japanese and Brazilians on the ship Benjamin Constant culminated in the arrival of the Japanese Sada Miyako to instruct jiu-jitsu in Brazil in 1908. In 1914 for the first time Maeda comes to Brazil dedicating himself to the southeast region. In 1915 Mario Aleixo becomes a jiu-jitsu teacher, and in 1917 Maeda returns to Brazil for the second time, this time already on the mission of teaching Jiu exclusively Kanojitsu, that is, Judo. He dedicated himself to the northern region of the country, since then he has not returned to Japan. In the same year Maeda, the birth of Fadda Jiu-jitsu. We can say that Oswaldo Fadda's first steps in the world of fights took place in noble art, that is, in boxing, through champion Baltazar Cardoso. That's because the fight options were just capoeira or boxing. In 1938, Marine Corps soldier, SD.FN.SFL, 38.4745.65, Fadda, met the coach Luiz de Franca, who was a direct student of Mitsuyo Maeda who was developing the practice of jiu-jitsu with the elite soldiers of the Navy. Bearing in mind that this art is very effective in improving military combat techniques and without directly requiring the use of kimonos for practice, as the uniform, jacket and camo, resembled the kimono, jiu-jitsu in the Navy took its format from military self-defense. In the course of numerous self-defense classes, Franca found in Fadda the opportunity to teach the jiu-jitsu traditionally taught by Maeda. In this way, Fadda starts wearing a kimono for the first time in his life. There he learned all the concepts taught by the personal defense instructor, Corporal Franca, with great effort and discipline. He stood out and advised the instructor, which was the reason that encouraged Franca to teach the true origins of personal defense in the Navy. Franca said that Fadda would be a student of great promise for the development of jiu-jitsu in Brazil, mainly for verifying his treatment with students, dedication in the development of techniques and ease in the teaching-learning process. In 1942, Luiz Franca decides to promote Fadda to the title of Professor Black Belt. Fadda would be the first and only student within the Japanese philosophical methodology taught in the Navy by the Japanese masters, in particular, Mitsuyo Maeda. He went to reserve military service in 1944 as a Marine soldier. He installed his objectives of spreading knowledge through classes to the most needy in the most humble region of the city, ended up being recognized as a precursor of jiu-jitsu in the region of the north, west of Rio de Janeiro and interior of the state. Mitsuyo Maeda, Count Koma. Born on November 18, 1879, a little before the First World War, a delegation of Japanese immigrants arrived in Brazil, Satake, Laku, Okura and Shimizu, and the Grand Master, world champion Isai, Koziai or Sensei Maeda. We believe newspapers at the time did not quite understand the meaning and confused the word sensei with Isai and Koziai. Maeda, a pioneer and introducer of jiu-jitsu in our country, after traveling all over the world, showing the jiu-jitsu learned from Tomita and Yokoyama, he taught Kano Judo/Kano Jiu-Jitsu, but he was not satisfied with just this branch of art. He made challenges and won undisputed victories against all types of fight. Due to the lack of popularization of this sport among us, his work did not arouse great interest. Only in the state of Para was he able to verify any results. Teaching Real Jiu-Jitsu to a small group of Brazilians, he had Jacinto Ferro among others as his disciples, but the young Carlos Gracie stood out at the time. Only Carlos took classes with Maeda. George and Elio learned from Carlos' demonstrations and classes. Mitsuyo Maeda, or Conde Koma, as he was known, arrived in Brazil in 1914 and 1917, twice in the southeast/south region and, finally, in the north region, where he met the Gracie family, referenced in the reports and annals of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and its construction. We emphasize that, in 1908, Jiu-Jitsu was already performed in Brazil, but the figure of Maeda was the popularly known landmark. Mitsuyo Maeda made a great contribution to the technical training of the most renowned Brazilian military institution throughout France. Together with other great Japanese representatives, he introduced personal defense in the Marine Corps, based entirely on jiu-jitsu brought from Japan in the professional training of Brazilian security. There is no official record of Maeda's passage in the CFN, only through France, as his valuable contribution is reflected among the ranks of the troop. Naturalized Brazilian, Maeda died on November 28, 1941 in Brazil under the name of Octavio Maeda, and his tomb is still in the city of Belém, in the state of Para. It still receives visits from admirers of different nationalities. The coach Luiz de Franca Filho. The Marine Corps of the Infantry, number 32.1900-69, Luiz de Franca Filho, born in the state of Alagoas on February 6, 1910, son of Luis de Franca Belém, and Maria José de Franca, joined the Brazilian Navy at the end of the 1920s. It was the forerunner of the Fadda story. Through the inheritance of self-defense passed from instructor to instructor in the Navy, France had gained the upper hand, as it had knowledge of jiu-jitsu through Maeda and still ratified it through the attack and defense instructions taught by Sada Miyako, the precursor of jiu-jitsu in Brazil, and Takeo Yano as predecessors when teaching the Brazilian Navy military self-defense techniques. Since they were profoundly knowledgeable of a complete martial art in every sense, and extremely proficient in military combat, they implemented their system so that the soldiers were prepared, since the climate already showed the possibility of a Second World War. Military jiu-jitsu being another method of fighting without weapons, among these military instructors was Cape France. He taught everyone in the Naval District, formerly also known as Fortaleza de São José, Snake Island, amphibious groupings, naval groupings and training schools and other units, all the principles of self-defense and hand-to-hand combat techniques. A military personal defense based entirely on Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. Corporal Luiz Franca, the most distinguished instructor among the Navy's military, knowledgeable of the true traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, with the noblest technical, liturgical and philosophical knowledge of the heritage of this art, took care to maintain all the Japanese teachings. Those practiced in a recreational and disciplinary way represented very well the knowledge of personal defense necessary for combat. Without any influence from Kano's Jiu-Jitsu, and valuing above all the roots left in the Navy that reflected the secular Japanese Jiu-Jitsu clans. Japan itself no longer valued Jiu-Jitsu, placing more emphasis on the growth of Judo. Due to the military nature of Cape France in an exemplary elite troop, and the rigid discipline to which they were subjected in the Marine Corps, it would reflect the traditional teachings of self-defense and its Oriental roots. Franca followed Maeda's guidelines. To teach the true Jiu-jitsu to those who could pass it on in order to win good fans and true warriors at heart. In the Marine Corps, Maeda was reflected throughout France, and found the ideal place to leave all his noblest knowledge. It followed the line of Eastern philosophy full of liturgies, original pronunciations of the language, basic concepts of hierarchy in discipline, throwing and throwing techniques, fall cushioning, ground maneuverability, immobilizations, joint and muscle locks, strangulations, self-defense, blows traumatics, reanimation, and even a vast arsenal of information and blows that are kept under lock and key by the masters of Academia Fadda de Bento Ribeiro. This fact was configured in the banning of techniques unknown to the general public in competitions, foot locks, leg locks, muscle strangulations. Professor Franca, through the reservation request based on Ordinance 840 of March 26, 1958, was reformed as sub-officer, Ordinance 0826 of June 17, 1969. On the 4th of July 1982, at the age of 72, the Marine and Grand Master Luis de Franca Filho left us. Bulletin N247 of November 19, 1982. His history as a fighter in public challenges, precursor and representative of fights, as well as the personal defense system adopted in the Marine Corps, was perpetuated among the military in units, not being registered as activities that were part of sports or pedagogical administration of the Navy. Therefore, information in the form of historical accounts is transferred to each other by former students who became instructors. A great example of this hall of multipliers is Sergeant Raul Arna Spengler, a vast connoisseur of the history of Navy Jiu-Jitsu left by former instructors Miyako, Yano, Maeda and Franca. On April 11, 2017, passed away, Raul Arnaud Spengler, aged 70. There is still a Fadda Jiu-Jitsu development unit at the current Almirante Milciades Portela Alves Instruction Center in Campo Grande, Rio de Janeiro through the Sports Force program, Profess. This unit forms recruits into Marine Corps soldiers while still preserving the roots of personal defense highlighted in military jiu-jitsu from the 1930s taught by Luis de Franca Filho. We can say that the Brazilian Navy, with the intervention of Sada Miyako since 1908, is the birthplace of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, and Luis de Franca Filho, being in the Marine Corps the master cell of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Fadda. Grand Master Oswaldo Baptista Fadda. Oswaldo Baptista Fadda, from Rio de Janeiro, born on August 1, 1920, in Rio de Janeiro, Bento Ribeiro neighborhood, descends from Italians, son of the military João Baptista Fadda and Adelina Josefina Batista Fadda. He was a kind man and known to be a good citizen and a very dynamic person. He was the first to start his Jiu-Jitsu academy in the suburbs of Rio without being a Gracie. He taught free classes to needy students and without the opportunity to practice martial art, which until then was very expensive, inaccessible to the most needy public at that time, 1940s. The Carioca Oswaldo Fadda stood out among other teachers due to his work with the most needy and the disabled. Fadda believed that Jiu-Jitsu, in addition to making people equal, could help cure and recover from many physical and emotional health problems. His first students were Alexander de Souza Neves, Chand, his friend, and also his older brother, Umberto Fadda, father of Elio Fadda. His classes were open to all young people, children and adolescents who were interested, and the payment was strict discipline to be obeyed, respect for parents and continuity in studies. The Fadda Academy became a great reference in the region, not because of the Jiu-Jitsu martial art, but because it served as a model and educational support, a socio-humanitarian so lacking at the time, because Fadda knew that Jiu-Jitsu would help the most humble people. As Jiu-Jitsu was not yet well known as a martial art in sports practice, Oswaldo Fadda, together with his students and teachers, traveled and did various demonstrations of fights and acrobatics. He did not choose places where he could put his mats, he would be there and even often without mats, on the floor itself. Oswaldo Fadda's troupe captivated new fans and surprised everyone, of all ages and cultures. Master Oswaldo Baptista Fadda, along with his group of students, performed in all possible and unimaginable places. Poor zones, public squares, beaches, hills, circuses, courtyards of churches and clubs, aiming at wide expansion and attracting followers for its martial art. A true show of skills available to anyone who was willing. Leaps over deadly obstacles, public challenges, fights against much stronger and bigger opponents. Capoeira was always seen in these challenges. The highlight was given at the end of each victorious combat. The representatives of Jiu-Jitsu, with great politeness, greeted their opponents. These were sometimes indignant, as they had not been beaten or felt pain from any trauma. They had blacked out after a strangulation, or even given up the fight due to strong momentary pain caused by some submission technique. The Oriental culture presented by Jiu-Jitsu fighters was through kimonos, greetings, respect, education and combat proficiency. A paradox that made Fadda Jiu-Jitsu a benchmark for everyone in that humble region. It motivated parents to include their children, because who would believe that a martial art of struggle, which teaches the youngest combat techniques, makes its followers become more tolerant, polite and calm. The difficulty in implementing Jiu-Jitsu wasn't just because it was a new and different martial art. For practice, mats and special clothing were needed. Fadda was so dedicated that he made the kimonos of his most needy students with fabrics from sacks of wheat flour left over from the bakery. Always friendly and generous, he even taught the disabled, often criticized. At that time, the disabled were marginalized and considered useless. Blue Rival, Torped and Juventino, Spider, were the ones who stood out the most in the academy and in real combat events. Both had physical handicaps that made it impossible to practice martial art. Spider had polio and muscle atrophy, while Torpedo was missing both legs. Fadda's disabled were challenged with disdain and, in the face of confrontation, they beat opponents without disabilities very easily. Fadda was a pioneer in the adaptation and insertion of the disabled in the context of martial art. He also dedicated all his enthusiasm to encouraging his students to become outstanding military personnel, such as paratroopers or Marines. In the history of Academia Fadda, it can be noted that more than 80% of its disciples followed this professional path. To this day, the profile of students and conduct at the academy reflect this military memory. In addition to being a master of Jiu-Jitsu, Fadda was the writer of the books Jiu-Jitsu and the Fall of Complexes and the book First Aids for Jiu-Jitsu. He was also a graduate and recognized philanthropist, Mason Master, essentially philosophical, philanthropic institution that works for the intellectual, moral improvement and social. Fadda was proud and made a point of presenting such a title through his signature, which at the end highlighted the 3 points of the Masonic schools in all the documents he signed. He worked as a manager at Port Citation and was a member of the Supreme Council of the Jiu-Jitsu Federation of Rio de Janeiro for many years. Together with Carlos Gracie and Elio Gracie, he was one of the first masters in the history of Jiu-Jitsu. Already a 9th degree red belt in Jiu-Jitsu and always at the side of his wife Isilia Fadda, our dear Master Fadda died in Bento Ribeiro on April 1, 2005 at the age of 84 after respiratory problems. Register that when composing this audiobook, Mrs. Isilia Fadda died last year 2022. After numerous achievements forming teachers, citizens, promoting courses and training in all areas, Fadda received from the Brazilian Confederation of Sports Jiu-Jitsu, CBJJE, Brazilian Confederation of Olympic Jiu-Jitsu, CBJJO and the Brazilian and International Association of Masters of Jiu-Jitsu, ABMJJ the highest title in Jiu-Jitsu in the world, the Red Belt, Grand Master of the 10th degree. Title that, according to the rules of CBJJ and FJJ Rio, could only be conferred to the Gracie brothers. For this reason, we highlight as fair and deserved the homage of these entities to the patron of suburban Jiu-Jitsu and thousands of ferries distributed all over the world. Alexander de Souza Neves Chandu. Born on October 13, 1922, in the neighborhood of Bento Ribeiro, Rio de Janeiro, where he lived throughout his life. His childhood was very difficult. Since he was a little boy he shined shoes to earn some change. At the age of 12 he started working in a bookbinding firm at Invalido Street 137, downtown, whose salary at the time was 18,000 cents per month. Then, with some experience and acquired knowledge, he started a new job at the construction store called Cambrance, which was located at Clarimundo de Melo Street, 815, Quintino. He stayed at the store for 7 years and, with enough practice, the boss promoted him to manager. Later he received an invitation from an old friend to become a partner in a grocery store where he worked for 2 years. In 1942, he took his license as a second-rate reservist in the firing line of the military school 406 of Madureira. In 1943, he prepared himself for war against his parents' will, not to learn to fight, but to defend the homeland, with a gun in hand and over 120 members assigned to training in Juiz de Fora, Tres Rios and Mato Grosso. In moments of great difficulty, suffering from hunger and basic needs, he returned months later to Rio de Janeiro to embark again, this time towards Europe. Without saying goodbye to his parents, friends and other relatives, because he didn't have time, he boarded the ship to Italy called Mariposa. The American ship SS Mariposa operated on the seas bringing supplies to support forces in distant countries, as well as rescuing people in foreign countries at the beginning of the war. With a troop capacity of 4,165 and a speed of 20.5 knots, it was one of the fastest transports and one of the largest ships, called monsters, usually sailed without escort. Staying 15 days at sea, Chandu arrives in Naples. With a luggage bag on his back, he was greeted by the sound of sirens announcing an air attack. He heard the sound of war for the first time. Desperate, seeing everyone running from one side to the other for shelter, he hid under the abandoned truck. I heard and saw the bombs hitting the ground, the screams of agony and despair, the sounds of friendly and enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft artillery. Surrounded by blood, despair and panic, he saw his colleagues injured and some dead, ambulances lined up on the pier, carrying the wounded. The first impact of the war left emotional scars that Chandu never forgot. In the ranks of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, FEB, he was a combatant of the Second World War in Italy. In one of the moments, Pope Pius XII visited and blessed the Brazilian troops. The time he stayed there ended up falling in love and knowing the love of an Italian girl named Giovanna in the city of Parida. SS Mariposa made the comeback, starting on July 11, 1945, when the first contingent embarked in Naples. The return operation was concluded with the arrival of the last echelon to the port of Rio de Janeiro, on October 3 of the same year. In Italy, as soon as they embarked, the soldiers embarked, and they didn't know if they would go to the Pacific Front, to fight the Japanese troops. In fact they didn't know their destinations, they were prepared for the war and their destinies traced. In the middle of the trip, it was announced that the war was over in the Pacific too. So they were back home. The return journey was even lighter and, in general, and in this case faster than the outward journey. With a force of 6,187 men, Chandu returns to Brazil as victorious. Faced with so much bravery, Master Chandu leaves the war after having faced a legion commanded by the most voracious executioner of humanity known on earth. Chandu, in a short time of training with Fadda, showed that he had a profile for the sport. Fadda promoted him to yellow belt. Chandu was so enthusiastic that he invited Fadda to open a permanent academy in the region and take his knowledge to as many people as possible, including himself. As a matter of fact, the Fadda Academy owes its birth to Chandu's initiative, because as soon as Fadda invited him to learn about Jiu-Jitsu, Chandu offered his home to start the first classes and start training as soon as possible. Chandu always acted as an outstanding teacher and friend of his students. Together with Fadda, he held the first Carioca Championship, organized by Academia Fadda in 1952. He became champion after a magnificent fight against the Japanese Matu Sanaga. He had always been an exemplary citizen, recognized by all members of the Jiu-Jitsu community as a worthy representative of the art, and he was much loved in his neighborhood. Until today, Master Chandu's deeds are highlighted in the region, arresting thieves, taking care of the most needy and preserving the concepts of discipline and respect for his students. On December 18, 1981, at the Sportive Cultural Center, where Fadda Academy is and has always been, Alexander Souza Neves, a 6th degree black belt, was promoted to a 7th degree red belt in Jiu-Jitsu. Note, at that time, coral belts did not exist, so the 7th degree was already a red belt. All of this happened without the direct presence of Oswaldo Fadda, who at that time already boasted the 8th degree of Jiu-Jitsu at red belt, because both throughout their friendship, at this moment, Fadda and Chandu were dealing with coldness and distance from each other. However, Fadda, when informed that other legal segments of the Jiu-Jitsu community and society had awarded him the merit of graduation, Oswaldo Fadda immediately went to the academy and personally ratified the promotion initiative with the recognition of his first graduated master and most dedicated student. Chandu was Oswaldo Fadda's first and only red belt grandmaster still alive. Currently, Fadda Academy of Bento Ribeiro highlights Chandu as important as Master Fadda himself, who is referenced in all representative academies in Brazil and abroad. He cultivated a healthy life through the practice of Swedish gymnastics, very popular at the time, and began his jiu-jitsu history in 1947, after an invitation from his friend Oswaldo Fadda, who had just left military life in the Marine Corps and, carrying a black belt that entitles him as a teacher of jiu-jitsu, a martial art unknown to Chandu until then. Due to his long friendship with Fadda and fondness for sports, young Chandu, 25 years old and already a war veteran, accepted the invitation of his friend Oswaldo and became one of the first students. He was soon joined by Oswaldo Fadda's brother, the eldest of the brothers, Umberto Fadda. In fact, if it weren't for Chandu, perhaps Jiu-Jitsu Fadda wouldn't have achieved all these achievements, nor would Fadda Academy exist. Therefore, we highlight Chand as equally important as Fadda. In 2007, aged 85, in the same neighborhood where he was born, raised and lived, Grand Master Alexander de Souza Neves, our dear and beloved Master Chandu, leaves us. Many of his students are still at Fadda Academy and record the good times they had with this fabulous master and great friend. Chandu left no genetic heirs to replace him, but his teachings are referenced in gyms and on the streets of the Bento Ribeiro neighborhood. Grand Master Umberto Fadda. Born on May 19, 1915, on Gita Street, in the Bento Ribeiro neighborhood, Rio de Janeiro. He began his career as a soldier in the Brazilian army, working in the cavalry. At the age of 42 he entered the reserves as a captain. At the age of 32, along with his friend Chandu, they were invited by their brother Oswaldo Fadda, who has just left the Marines with the title of Jiu-Jitsu teacher, to start classes in this art. He was one of the first students and teacher of the Fadda Jiu-Jitsu lineage, along with Chandu, Fadda's most prominent student, the difference being that Umberto was Oswaldo's older brother, and together, through Chandu's initiative and support, they started the gym project in a space provided by Chandu in his home. Later, Chandu invited them to open a real academy together. 2 years later, in 1948, his first and only child was born, which made him pay more attention to his role as a father and leave the Fadda Academy project for a period. At the academy he introduced his 7-year-old son to Professors Chandu and Oswaldo, his uncle. In 1960, Umberto would open a Fadda branch, together with his son Elio Fadda, where until 1982 he remained representing the Fadda name and making great champions of the time. On September 21, 2007, 2 years after the death of his brother and Master Oswaldo Fadda, Master Umberto Fadda also leaves us at the age of 92. Throughout his life, there were few accounts of this precursor of Jiu-Jitsu Fadda, but, together with Master Chandu, he provided the first incentives for Oswaldo Fadda to fulfill his dream of promoting Jiu-Jitsu. Its history continues through the living heritage highlighted in the current Fadda Academy by Bento Ribeiro and his heir Elio Fadda. Jiu-Jitsu Ferry Academies. Around 1947, Oswaldo Fadda sought to publicize and establish a place or group that corresponded to everything he had learned in the Marine Corps, that is, to attract students to learn Jiu-Jitsu. Later, we will explain in detail. Based on the initiative and support of his student and friend Chandu, this first student of his opened Academia Fadda at João Vicente Street, N-squared 1155 and later, 1191, Bento Ribeiro and other addresses that were also the base of Fadda. In the many storms that occurred, many were the changes, however the exact date of the foundation of Academia Fadda de Bento Ribeiro is January 27, 1950. In this historic place, Fadda Academy introduced Jiu-Jitsu to this humble, yet familiar and dignified, region of the city of Rio de Janeiro. In detail, the ferry is still in the same place today, 1950-2023. Ferry academies began to exist more frequently in the city, expanding to the West Zone, increasing the circle of the North Zone and also directing its axis to the Rio de Janeiro region and the interior of the state. It all started in a space provided by Chandu in his home, so that Fadda could offer his first classes, Papari Street, 126. Later Chandu invited them to open an academy together in Bento Ribeiro. Soon after, Umberto would open the first and only Fadda branch in 1960 in the Cascadura neighborhood, AV suburban number 10,033, where it remained until 1982. Academia Fadda de Bento Ribeiro, over 60 years old, is still standing and in order in the same place since its foundation, at Rua João Vicente, 1191, Bento Ribeiro. Commanding the legacy was Oswaldo Fadda's nephew, Professor Elio Fadda, Grand Master of Jiu-Jitsu Red Belt of the 9th degree, who with great enthusiasm and joy welcomes all the heirs of the Fadda legacy of Jiu-Jitsu and teaches their classic Jiu-Jitsu in the same mold and guidelines as his teachers Oswaldo, Umberto, and Chandu. Currently a single descendant Fadda in the degree of Grand Master, who currently directs the Fadda Academy and is one of the few masters who graduated and recognized in all federations and confederations as a 9th degree Red Belt, Grand Master of Jiu-Jitsu Elio Batista Fadda. Based on calculations, perhaps Elio Fadda is the last directly Fadda heir to reach the rank of Grand Master in the history of the Fadda family. Many are the heirs of the Fadda Jiu-jitsu style, many are the academies and teachers who defend this flag. This is due to the characteristic of proximity to the students' families and the relationship with the social segments, so important for the development of Fadda Jiu-jitsu. The focus of Fadda academies has always been and will always be people. The results are in the personal and individual achievements of each member of this family. In the academies that follow the Fadda doctrine, we find a strong presence of discipline, empathy and charisma. As much as Bento Ribeiro is the official base and point of reference for Fadda Jiu-jitsu, we affirm that it is just a building there, an ephemeral and shatterable material structure. The Fadda Academy performs every day through men, women, young people and children through the demonstration of education, respect and exemplary social behavior, inside or outside the Fadda Academy structure. The construction of Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. In the 1930s, Jiu-jitsu and its fights with or without a kimono were imposing themselves through incontestable victories against other forms of fights that existed. Capoeira, Greco-Roman wrestling, boxing and later judo and karate also took part in the disputes to see which martial art offered the best results in combat. Epic and memorable fights by Brazilians against physically stronger opponents placed Jiu-jitsu above all other forms of fighting, since, in most combats, when it was taken to the ground, it was verified that the fighters did not have the knowledge of combat in the ground. There were few occasions when other stand-up fights had results over Jiu-jitsu. The public challenges were intended to attract students and give Jiu-jitsu notoriety as the best martial art of all. Some Japanese participated in shows in circuses, arenas, clubs and theaters, making public challenges, such as Sada Miyako, Gio Amori, Mitsuyo Maeda among others, and already in the 40s, Jiu-jitsu was already widely developed by the brothers Carlos, George and Elio Gracie in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Around the 1950s, in the suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, a jiu-jitsu emerged that did not come from the famous Gracie. Both styles of jiu-jitsu, Fadda and Gracie, grew up together, but each with a different performance, but still basically the same. The Gracie family, very well known and referred to as a representative of jiu-jitsu, was unaware of the existence of another source of the same jiu-jitsu other than those taught through the Gracie family. It was when, in a daring move in 1955, the Grand Master Fadda, in a respectful but forceful manner, challenged the practitioners of the Gracie Academy commanded by Master Elio Gracie to face the representatives of the Fadda Academy in a jiu-jitsu combat, face-to-face. Elio Gracie saw the opportunity to make his students practice and compete in jiu-jitsu with other practitioners and not with his own students, as there were no other jiu-jitsu practitioners in the city. It would be a good chance to show superiority and hegemony of Gracie jiu-jitsu. Elio Gracie always liked challenges and didn't know his opponents. He accepted, but a bit incredulous in a jiu-jitsu that could at least come close to what was developed by the family. Fadda, on the other hand, received with great joy and enthusiasm the opportunity to bring to light a different vision of jiu-jitsu than Gracie's. This is on their shoulders the responsibility of Oswaldo and Elio to put into practice all the jiu-jitsu they taught, making their athletes fight opponents at the height and equality of martial art. 20 Fadda students against 20 Gracie students fought sportingly for the first time in the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in the center of the city at the Gracie Academy. Under the wings and blessings of Oswaldo Baptista Fadda and Elio Gracie, the first dispute that marked the birth of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Because on that day, the main representatives of this oriental martial art developed in Brazil ratified that the teachings of Count Koma, Mitsuyo Maeda, were absorbed and technically improved by the 40 athletes that day. Elio Gracie was surprised by the technical performance of his Fadda's opponents and publicly congratulated them for demonstrating such unexpected technical proficiency. The Fadda Academy athletes stood out for their unusual techniques for the Gracies, many matches won with foot, leg, and hand locks, and an improved takedown system right at the beginning of the matches. Such an unusual performance of submissions with leg and foot locks resulted in a title that every fighter from the suburbs was shoemaker, as a way of diminishing the value of the executed technique. In some other competitions, one of the competitors named Adurbal Baptista, a renowned and respected Fadda student, was registered in the newspaper as a representative of the shoemaker syndicate. We don't know if it was really true or if Adurbal Baptista had done it to make fun of those who cursed the fairies. We know that this fact is, to say the least, curious. The result favored the once unknown fairies, as just the fact that out of 14 fights, drawing 4 and winning 3 was already a feat worthy of attention. On that day, Fadda reported in the newspapers that we broke the taboo of the Gracie, and confirming the feat, Elio Gracie recognizes it from another jiu-jitsu source other than the Gracies in the city of Rio de Janeiro. There had to be a Fadda for us to know that jiu-jitsu is not just a Gracie privilege. From this historic jiu-jitsu sports confrontation, sporting challenges between Gracie and Fadda's students became more frequent, and Elio and Oswaldo always took advantage of these fights to present their technical innovations and study new moves. In this way, they improved the newborn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This was the milestone in the implementation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the Fadda e Gracie Challenge kicked off the creation of this martial art in a sporting way. However, there was never a fight between Professors Oswaldo Fadda and Elio Gracie, because, in 1952, Elio Gracie, after the fight with Kimura in 1951, had stopped fighting challenges, but continued training and teaching the new jiu-jitsu movements that had improved. Oswaldo Fadda and Elio Gracie knew each other. They were respectful friends long before the challenge and were fully aware that if they fought jiu-jitsu with each other they could compromise the characteristics of a Fadda teacher. A good jiu-jitsu teacher must initially understand that having reached the black belt does not mean that he really has the conditions to teach. However, to be a teacher it is essential that he has reached the said belt. Having reached a black belt, even if he is an emeritus fighter, just means having won a great stage in the sport. Oswaldo Fadda reports the texts in his book, Jiu-Jitsu and the Fall of the Complexes, and since he is our main reference, all of us as fairy fighters, will follow these words. He said,
"It is not my intention to take the jiu-jitsu teacher to the heights, nor to complicate or make the art of teaching something unattainable. I will only try to show the importance of the teacher of this subject. In society the field is vast for studies and research, with surprising results for all those who are dedicated to the practice of jiu-jitsu, and especially for teachers who improve themselves by discovering new skills in themselves. For the best performance of the functions they have proposed, I usually say, and this is not going to be an exaggeration, that to be a good jiu-jitsu teacher, without detracting from the other subjects, it is necessary to meet the greatest number of requirements. 1. Achieving a black belt on its own merits. 2. Have self-criticism and a sense of what is ridiculous. 3. Have good diction and know how to communicate. 4. Personality and inspire confidence. 5. Have pedagogical knowledge and method, notions of psychology and know how to apply them. 6. Notions of public and human relations. 7. Be a natural, optimistic and self-sufficient leader. 8. Make jiu-jitsu, in addition to sport and recreation, complementary education. These and many other qualities are born, blossom and develop in those who practice and teach jiu-jitsu. It is known that pedagogy is fundamentally important for those who teach. Without it, whatever the topic, the class becomes monotonous and boring. The teacher he values is always concerned with his work method, in addition to strictly following the previously outlined curriculum. You will have discovered, at the end of each class, better conditions in the art of transmitting, becoming more and more capable of transforming the most monotonous and boring topics into pleasant and busy classes. Your arguments must be sound, logical and judicious. It is extremely important to psychologically prepare the students before any practical class, as well as the examples transported to reality. In this way, he will have instilled in the students' minds in a more positive way, not only the technical part but also leaving him open to new perspectives, triggering encouragement in his disciples and effectively collaborating in the elimination of complexes and inhibitions. Teachers must not forget when they propose to do this work, which is exactly why adults seek them out and entrust their children to their care. Success consists in understanding and giving solutions to as many people as seek it out, not to teach them how to sell blows and counterattacks, but what they expect is someone who can diagnose and solve the ills that afflict them. This is a therapy for their case. To practice teaching, therefore, to be a good jiu-jitsu teacher, it is not necessary to have a university degree or equivalent, nor to be a psychoanalyst. The important thing is to be honest in your purposes and have a sense of the ridiculous. Over the years, the studious professor of the subject acquires an extraordinary psychology, to the point of knowing if someone is bluffing or evaluating the character of a professor. For this, it will not be necessary to send him to the mat to show his qualities. It is enough that he lets himself talk about the matter, and soon not only his real capacity will be latent, but also his mediocrity or total incompetence. The jiu-jitsu teacher, when skilled and interested in the social problems of his school, will be able to produce what someone has already said are miracles, but, in fact, it is nothing more than making jiu-jitsu a therapy to aid medical treatment. In most cases of physical and mental anomalies. The teacher's greater understanding of his dedication is the satisfaction of having fulfilled his duty, of his students free from inhibitions and complexes, becoming citizens capable of overcoming the obstacles in their lives, making them more useful to the homeland, society themselves. It is evident that, in order to obtain these results, it is necessary for the candidate to have willpower and for his teacher to be dedicated and very patient. Turning laymen into fighters is a very easy task. If it weren't for vanity, many who think they have nothing more to learn, it would be something fascinating, of great importance for everyone to contribute willingly and remove the mask of vanity. Master Fadda's philosophical and technical concepts. 1. Those who practice jiu-jitsu don't perfect themselves to fight, they also fight to improve. 2. To know yourself is to master yourself, to triumph. 3. The good practitioner has the intelligence to understand what they teach, the patience to teach what he has learned to his peers, and the faith to believe in what he does not understand. For anyone who thinks about losing is already defeated. 5. Perfection is only approached by those who seek it with constancy and wisdom and, above all, with great humility. 6. Knowing a little more every day is used every day for good, this is the way of true men. 7. When you sadly find that you know nothing, you will have made your first progress in learning. 8. Never be proud of having beaten an opponent, whoever beats this one today can defeat you tomorrow. 9. The only victory that lasts is that won over ignorance itself. 10. In the waters of the river of life, who swims as he should, when he should go, as far as he should swim, goes further. 11. Frankness is touchy, ignorance is spiteful, knowledge is the power of understanding. He who understands forgives. 12. Better to fight than feline action. 13. The body is a weapon whose efficiency depends on the precision with which intelligence is used. 14. The will is the trophy of victory. 15. Winning easy is not only difficult, but triumphing without glory. 16. He who decides to stop until things get better will find that he who has not stopped is so far ahead that he will never be reached.
Final considerations and next volumes. This work is the beginning of a long and pretentious work, with the objective of making available to the public some knowledge and concepts that, nowadays, are no longer part of the context of jiu-jitsu academies, nor of the story that is told by the teachers. When we refer to the life and death of jiu-jitsu, we try to cause the paradox that exists in affirmations, in which we can dazzle all the way that the original Japanese jiu-jitsu has gone through the years, its falls and rebirths. To this day, jiu-jitsu dies and is born again within each new fan of this fabulous martial art. Some compare judo and jiu-jitsu, sometimes without knowing that judo originates from Japanese jiu-jitsu, as well as our Brazilian jiu-jitsu. It is true that judo and jiu-jitsu are very similar. We know that judo was created by the great teacher Jigoro Kano, however, without all the knowledge that original jiu-jitsu brings. The jiu-jitsu taught and developed in Brazil received a structure that is incomparably highlighted as an effective personal defense system. We speak of our heroic ancestors who, sacrificing their own health, challenged the world in favor of this martial art. We highlight in this work the fairies, because it is a little-known segment, and the author is also a fairy. With the purpose of really highlighting this family, without a doubt, if it weren't for the strongholds of the Gracie family and its students, jiu-jitsu would not have this proportion. Comparing with judo, for example, after the death of Jigoro Kano, the teachers of the Kodokan school decided to insert several movements and techniques inherent to jiu-jitsu that had not been highlighted by the founder of judo in his creation. Today we can see in judo that, from the black belt onwards, many movements and techniques are reminiscent of ancient Japanese jiu-jitsu. For example, the use of traumatic blows, the use of swords and weapons and even exclusive personal defense techniques, and many other blows that were not publicized while Jigoro Kano was alive. Fadda cannot insert much into Oswaldo Fadda's total jiu-jitsu concept. We are still in the resistance to survive in a jiu-jitsu that values people for what they are and not for their titles. A jiu-jitsu that can serve as a means of living and educating your children. Such precepts are the mark that highlights the life of jiu-jitsu at the original Fadda Academy by Bento Ribeiro. Our fairy jiu-jitsu is still alive, but it could also cease to exist as the original form, continuously transforming into a process of feedback and finding him in himself. Faced with the evolution of our jiu-jitsu, let's check videotapes, photos and records. How were real combat fights and sporting combats or old jiu-jitsu fights carried out? Huge differences in the fighter's performance, far outside of the jiu-jitsu we see today. When reviewing the epic combats, we were surprised, even causing the impression of an inefficient jiu-jitsu, that is, jiu-jitsu that does not fully correspond to our current situation. Therefore, he is born and dies every day. In fact, many of us miss that old jiu-jitsu, without frills or tied games of rules. But that's how jiu-jitsu was born and reborn many times. By Asian origins, we refer to a type of fight originating Japanese jiu-jitsu, fragmented into other fights, for us, as a base the traditional jiu-jitsu that would become Brazilian jiu-jitsu, developing as jiu-jitsu, sports jitsu and currently becoming professional sports jiu-jitsu and so on. In the next volumes, we will continue the historical context, we will also register other names and celebrities who participated in this history and we will work in the context of technical, practical and philosophical diffusion. We reach the end of this work with the certainty that we awakened in each reader and or listener of this audiobook a new vision of the same art practiced in different pedagogical lines. Knowing this, we highlight the advance apologies if we do not reach the results and expectations, and also, if this feat showed vanity or arrogance. Our intention was fair and noble, aiming solely and exclusively at providing academic and historical support for jiu-jitsu, in particular jiu-jitsu Fadda. We dedicate this work to Grand Master Oswaldo Fadda and his family. In addition to oral consultations and reports from people of the time, and also the direct guidance of Elio Fadda, the real reason for the achievement of this work. We had as bibliographical sources: 1. The book Jiu-Jitsu and the Fall of Complexes /1983. By Oswaldo Baptista Fadda, publisher Z. Valentin. 2. The book Dom Quixote Warrior, Life and Work of Master Fadda /2005. By Guilherme Baptista Fadda, Editora ITC Slimbach. 3. The Student Handbook, Black Belt Module, /2016. By Hermes C. Arduli, manufactured. 4. The book First Aids for Jiu-Jitsu /1993. By Oswaldo Baptista Fadda, manufactured. 5. The book The Story of Chandu, Autobiography /1983. By Alexander de Souza Neves, manufactured. 6. Consultations on the Internet, www.portalfab.com.br and www.wikipedia.org. This work was transformed into an audiobook for a better understanding of all jiu-jitsu fans, especially Fadda. We know that improvements are still needed, but we have taken the first step towards a more efficient and effective future in jiu-jitsu research. The Internet is a very promising vehicle for this, in which YouTube and the website Fadda are our means of information. Therefore, we will count the number of visitors, through their clicking on the like, and not by the number of views. Mainly you who are a fairy and are studying and researching click on like so we can follow the real views, even if you don't like it, this will be the way we follow the visitors. We look forward to your visit at the Bento Ribeiro Academy in Rio de Janeiro and in a personal way you can consult us. Big hug from Elio Fadda. Endurance. The Life and Death of Jiu-Jitsu. ISBN N2-978-85-518-29773. First edition in July 2019. Publisher Autografia Limited Edition and Communication. Rua Marinque Veiga, N2 10th floor, downtown, Rio de Janeiro, RJ. All rights reserved. Reproduction of this work for commercial purposes is prohibited. Copyright 2017 at 2023. Fadda Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. All rights reserved. All texts, images, graphics and other materials are protected by copyright and other intellectual property rights belonging to Fadda Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, its subsidiaries, affiliates and licensors. Fadda Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is also the owner of the copyright for the development, selection, coordination, layout of the materials in this work. It is expressly forbidden to copy or reproduce these materials for commercial use or distribution, to modify these materials, to include them in other vehicles and to send them and publish them in other digital and physical media, or in any other way dispose of such materials without the proper authorization, being subject to legal responsibilities and sanctions.